In this video we will be modding the 60% STK61 keyboard that I reviewed a few weeks ago. What's up guys, it's tech-raccoon back with another video, and as I promised last week, I have modded this STK61 keyboard and I'll be walking you through the process of modding this keyboard. But first let me start off with a basic overview of the keyboard, so people who haven't watched the review do know what this keyboard is all about. So this keyboard costs 35 Australian dollars. It's a 60% mechanical keyboard that you can get with either blue switches or red switches on eBay or Amazon. The brand is Ajazz. It's not a very known brand for me at least, but some people out there probably have heard of it. And the keyboard in general is actually a very good value for money. Stock, the typing experience is pretty good, and it's not really that much to complain about for 35 Australian dollars. It definitely competes with the likes of like a Razer Huntsman. So here's a quick sound test clip of what this keyboard sounds completely stock. So the keyboard definitely doesn't sound bad stock, but it could definitely do with some work. And later on in the video, we will be doing a proper comparison in sound. So I started off by pulling apart the keyboard and basically taking it down to just the case. So once I'd taken it apart, I started off by using 800 grit sandpaper with a little bit of water and just giving it a very light sand to smoothen out the board and make the paint stick on a little better. And now when I say paint, I actually didn't end up using paint. I didn't really have a grey paint in the garage, so I decided to just use primer, and I'm pretty happy with the result anyway. So I just found some grey plastic primer lying around the garage, and I put 3 coats on, waiting about half an hour in between each coat and giving it a light sand in between each coat as well. I did want to put clear coat on to protect the primer, but we actually ran out of clear coat, so I might put that on later down the track when I do end up buying some. So I was pretty happy with the finish that this keyboard came out with a nice grey. I think it looks a lot better than the white, but that's just my personal opinion. The next thing I did was find some pieces of foam just lying around in the garage. I didn't put a lot because honestly it doesn't make a huge difference if we're being honest. It just makes it a little bit nicer of a sound. But I did put some in, and while I was at it, I put a few layers of tape on the bottom of the PCB. Now I used electrical tape, but masking tape also works. And I just basically went around the capacitors and left those sticking out how they're meant to. And I did notice that it made the sound just that touch more poppy, but to be honest, it doesn't make a huge difference. Now the next thing which I did, which is basically the main mod of this keyboard, is lubing the switches and stabilizers. And this is a pretty lengthy process usually because you have to unsolder the switches and all that. But I found a much easier method, which does get a lot more messy, mind you, and can mess up the keyboard a lot, so you'll have to probably clean it up with a bit of methylated spirits later. But basically all I did was I pressed down the stem of each switch, which allows you to have a little bit of gap in there, and then I used my SRAM butter, which is like a suspension grease for bikes. I put it inside the switch, and then I sort of played around with the stem a little bit, and I would listen to each one to see if it made a difference in sound, which it did after you put enough in there. And then I just go switch by switch and do that, and it was a lot faster than pulling everything apart, especially because this keyboard is soldered, and it actually made the sound way better. But one downside with this method is that you can't actually get fully into the stabilizers and pull them apart. So that means to lube these stabilizers, you have to really force a lot of lube in there, and this is where things can get very messy. You'll kind of have to basically just force as much lube into where the metal rod collides with the actual stabilizer part there, and just basically stuff that with lube. And even after I did this, you can still hear some rattle. So you can't really get the best results in terms of stabilizers with this method, but it will sound a lot better than stock, as you'll hear in the sound test. I also used a very small syringe, and I actually sort of pumped some of this grease in there to the tighter spaces that you can't get to, but that didn't make a huge difference if I'm being honest, so just using a brush is fine. But I'd say it's a pretty self-explanatory process. And as a side note here, I would like to say that I actually tried out doing a bit of a wet lube method on all the letter keys earlier on, and I was a little disappointed if I'm being honest. I did spray some silicone spray into each switch, but after about a week or so, I noticed that all the silicone had basically just dried up and the sound was just like stock again. So I just decided to go with the very thin grease. Even though it does take a fair bit longer to do this method, I'd say it's very much worth it for the sound you get at the end. And then the last step was just to install the keycaps. I bought these keycaps from eBay, and I will leave a link in the description below if you are interested. They come in a few colors. I got the yellow one, and yeah, it does look pretty nice. I like the font. Just one thing to note is that I'm guessing the letters on all the keycaps will eventually rub off, because it looks to me like they're just printed on instead of actually being a double shot keycap. So after all the work we've done to this keyboard, I gotta say I'm very happy with the looks of the keyboard. I really like the grey mixed with the yellow and the white. Definitely is a more unique looking board than what it was before with just this pure white. And that's the good thing about modding keyboards. You can really just make it look and sound exactly how you want it to. So here's a sound test of what it sounded like before and after, and let me know what you think in the comments below if you think it sounded a lot better or not. I personally think it sounds way better. So would I recommend modding this keyboard? Well, absolutely. For 35 Australian dollars, you get a very good result if you spend a few hours working on this keyboard. It sounds pretty good. The stabilizers are the only big downside of this keyboard, but still, you can make them sound somewhat decent just with a bit of work. So for 35 Australian dollars, this is a very good keyboard to get into the keyboard modding game. And honestly, I was very surprised with how good it sounded, considering the amount of money I spent and just the amount of time I spent as well. It was pretty good. Obviously, if you have a much more expensive keyboard, I would not recommend lubing the switches in my method, but for a cheap keyboard like this, it definitely does the trick. It's not going to be the most consistent lube, but it definitely improves the sound of the switches. So if you did enjoy the video, drop a like on the video. If you didn't, drop a dislike on the video. Remember to subscribe for more videos like this, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.